The air inside the birthing room was thick enough to drink, sweet with rot and candle smoke, the kind of heat that made sound itself too tired to rise. Outside, the Alabama night hummed with frogs and fever, but within those walls, only silence. Not the sacred hush of a prayer, but the suffocating stillness of something that had already decided there would be no life here tonight. The women stood barefoot on the warped floorboards, skirts damp, eyes glistening with fear and sweat. Their breaths were shallow, trembling, watching Judith Harper, the midwife no one had wanted, but whom every woman secretly prayed for when the time came. Her eyes were deep wells, her hands steady as if the heat and screaming around her belonged to another world. They said Judith had been born on the same plantation she now served, but no one had ever heard who her mother was, or if her mother had lived long enough to name her. The woman in labor, Dinah, clutched the sheets until her knuckles went white. Her cries had weakened into small broken sounds. "Push," Judith whispered, but not to Dinah. Her lips barely moved, the words sliding into the air like a spell cast sideways, something beneath her tone, a rhythm, slow, deliberate, ancient. The other midwives watched her in terror, knowing they should help, knowing also they shouldn't. For Judith's way was not like theirs. No hymns, no pleas to Jesus, only that murmuring chant that had no place in the Bible. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the scent of the nearby river, stagnant, heavy with the ghost of long-buried things. When it was over, Dinah's body lay limp, her chest fluttering like a trapped bird. Judith's hands were red to the wrists, yet she did not move to clean them. She only looked down at what had come from the woman. Small, still, perfectly formed. And then she said the words that none dared repeat in full, better still than shackled. A single candle flickered, throwing shadows across the peeling walls. The others in the room stared. Some began to weep, others backed toward the door. "Judith," one of them hissed, "you cursed this child, didn't you?" Judith turned slowly, her eyes catching the flame. "No," she said softly, "I freed it." Her voice was not defiant, not proud, only tired and so full of knowing that no one could meet her gaze. She reached for the child, wrapped it in the linen she'd brought herself. Linen stained with old rust, older secrets. Then she placed it upon the table by the window, and the candle beside it went out. The room plunged into half-darkness, and for a breath no one dared move. Then came the faintest sound, like a sigh escaping from the walls themselves, a whisper of relief, of release, or perhaps of hunger. Judith pressed a hand to the window pane, her fingers leaving streaks of blood that glowed faintly in the moonlight. "It's done," she murmured. But the women did not hear peace in her tone, only warning. "What's done?" one asked, her voice trembling. Judith's eyes flicked toward the cradle. "Only what must be done when mercy outweighs obedience." Outside, the cricket stopped. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. One of the younger women crossed herself, muttering a prayer that faltered halfway. Another turned toward the door, but it did not open. The latch refused to lift, as though the room itself meant to keep them there until something finished its work. Then came the faintest creak, the cradle moving, rocking gently. No wind, no hand, yet moving all the same. Judith closed her eyes. "Don't look," she said quietly, but they did. They always did. Inside the cradle lay the child, still silent, yet its lips were wet, and upon its chest, where there should have been breath, there was only the faint shimmer of light, like the reflection of a chain submerged in water, just before it sinks. The candle flame near Judith flared once, then steadied, and she whispered into the silence, "They won't take you." The floor beneath her feet groaned, as though something heavy moved beneath it. A weight she had buried, perhaps, or one that never stayed buried long. By morning, when the door finally opened on its own, the bed was empty, the cradle overturned, and Judith was gone. But every woman who had been there swore that for nights afterward, when the wind passed through the cypress trees near the slave quarters, they could hear a faint, tender lullaby, the kind that no mother should ever have to sing, and beneath it, just barely, a whisper, better still than shackled. The dawn after Judith vanished came grey and swollen with heat, the kind of morning that made the air thick enough to chew. that made the flies gather before the dew had time to settle, and across the Harper plantation, the women woke with a taste in their mouths that was not their own. The milk they had drawn the night before, warm, rich, meant for infants barely clinging to the world, had soured in the night. It hissed softly when poured, a faint fizzing, like something alive inside it trying to breathe. And when the first mother raised the tin cup to her nose, she gagged, not from rot, but from something worse, something unnatural. It smelled of blood and of something that remembered being alive. No one spoke Judith's name aloud that morning. They spoke around it, her one, that woman, the one who cursed the cradle. But even the whispers drew flies. By midday, the babies had begun to cry, sharp, thin sounds that broke the quiet in cruel ways. But the worst of it came when the crying stopped. The infants turned their heads from the breast, mouths rooting blindly but refusing to latch, their tiny bodies trembling, faces grey as if some invisible hunger hung in the air and drained them. Dinah, who'd survived the night Judith disappeared, was the first to notice the pattern. She'd seen the same tremor once before, years ago, when the river ran black with sickness and mothers buried their children before sunrise. She said nothing at first, only wrapped her own baby tighter and rocked it until her arms went numb. By evening, the overseer's wife had sent for Reverend Coleman from the next county, a tall man with hands too soft for the Bible he carried. He came with his collar starched white and his words pre-polished. He spoke of faith and cleansing and women's hysteria. But when he dipped his fingers into the bucket of milk they offered him, it burned, not with heat but with cold so deep it blistered. The Reverend recoiled, clutching his hand, and the women watched, eyes wide, remembering the touch of Judith Harper's fingers, the same calm, steady coldness that had once brought children into the world, and now, it seemed, had taken them away. "Where is she buried?" he demanded, but no one answered, for no one had buried her. Her cabin stood empty still, door unlatched, the bed unslept in, but her things remained, the stained linens, the iron bowl. The dried herbs hung from the ceiling like old prayers that had forgotten their language. When the Reverend stepped inside, the air grew colder, and from somewhere in the walls came the faint sound of dripping, not water, not rain, and slower, heavier. He found the source behind the hearth, a clay jar sealed with wax. On its lid was pressed the mark of a hand, small, childlike, and when he lifted it, the jar wept. A single bead of white rolled down its side, trailing the scent of milk turned grave sweet. That night, word spread fast. The women claimed they heard Judith humming near the river, a tune no one had taught her, low and slow, the same rhythm she'd whispered during births. And the next morning, every cow on the property lay dead, their udders swollen, their mouths foaming pale. The master's wife ordered the river blocked, said the water had gone bad, that the Lord was testing them. But when her own infant refused her breast 3 days later, she tore her dress open and screamed for Judith like a saint gone mad. No one came, only the sound of the cradle creaking in the next room, slow, steady, though no one was near it. One of the housegirls peeked inside. The baby lay still, eyes wide open, and above its tiny lips floated a faint white mist, not breath, but milk rising like smoke. By the week's end, the whole plantation had stopped producing milk. The cows were gone. The women's breasts ran dry, and even the river took on a strange pallor, white at the edges, as though some ancient sickness had poured itself into its veins. The Reverend fled after that. They said he left before sunrise, muttering about salt and blood and the book of Exodus. But some swore they saw him again, weeks later, wandering the fields barefoot, his right hand swollen and pale, milk leaking from the cracks in his skin. Dinah, though, stayed. She buried her baby beneath the magnolia tree where Judith had once stood singing, and before she covered the grave, she found something buried there already, small bones wrapped in cloth. The cloth embroidered with a mark she knew too well, the spiral Judith traced in blood the night the crying stopped. That night, Dinah dreamed of the birthing room again, the heat, the candles, the hush before the scream. But this time Judith wasn't delivering life. She was gathering it back, collecting what had been taken, one soul at a time, and when Dinah woke, her tongue was coated in something sour. Her milk had returned, thick, white, and stinking of the grave. She stumbled outside, desperate, choking, and as the dawn broke over the fields, She saw her reflection in the well, her face pale, eyes hollow, and behind her, faint but clear, Judith Harper smiling softly. Holding a child that wasn't hers, the reflection rippled once, then the water turned white. The sound began at night, a slow rhythmic clatter, like metal breathing through wood, soft at first, then deliberate, as if something below the floor had grown tired of waiting. The overseer, Josiah Crane, was not a man who feared ghosts, but even he began to dream of the sound, of iron links slithering in the dark, dragging something far too small to pull them. For 3 nights it came the same way, in a shuffle, a metallic whisper, a lull between heartbeats, and then silence thick enough to choke on. By the 4th he'd had enough. He stormed through the slave quarters at dawn, boot heels snapping against dirt like gunfire, shouting that someone was stealing his chains, his property. He tore open doors, kicked over beds, and found nothing but frightened eyes staring back. It was Dinah who spoke first, her voice thin, shaking. "They ain't gone, sir. They just moved." Josiah turned toward her, rage bright as fever. "Moved where?" She nodded toward Judith's old cabin, the one no one slept in anymore. By noon, Josiah had gathered 3 men with hammers. They marched to that small, crooked cabin, the one sagging against the magnolia tree, the one where the air still carried the scent of candle smoke and old blood. He kicked the door open. Inside, dust floated like ghosts waiting to be named. The boards creaked beneath his weight, each step answered by that faint sound again, the slow drag of iron through dry earth. He knelt, pressed his ear to the floor. The sound stopped. Then faintly as a whimper, not quite human. He ordered the men to tear up the planks. Hammers struck, wood splintered. The floor gave way to a black hollow breathing cold into the room. Josiah knelt again, lantern in hand. The light reached down, catching something that glimmered. Something curved, delicate, white. At first, he thought they were roots. Then he saw the shape of fingers. The soft curve of a skull the size of his palm. Infant bones layered and twisted together like a nest, wrapped in linen marked with faint red script. The script was not written, but carved, long shallow cuts forming spirals, circles, and a single crooked symbol pressed into each skull. The same symbol Judith Harper had traced in blood the night she vanished. Josiah staggered back. "What is this?" he barked, but his voice came out strangled. One of the men crossed himself. Another dropped his hammer. Dinah, who had followed them to the door, whispered, "It's her work. She sealed them. She kept him from the chain." The overseer turned on her. "You speak nonsense, woman." But even as he spoke, the lantern flame trembled, and from below came the faintest jingle, metal sliding over bone. The men ran. Only Josiah remained. He stared down into that dark pit, and for a moment, he swore he saw movement, not a creature, not a ghost, but the slow unfurling of something bound in iron, a single chain coiling like a serpent, wrapping itself around the bones it once held. He reached in with the lantern. The light revealed what he thought were links, but no, they were ribs fused together with rust. At their center, something pulsed, faintly like a heart beneath earth. Josiah stumbled back, knocking over the lantern. Flame spilled across the boards. The cabin filled with smoke, but the fire did not spread. It only smoldered, and breathing, feeding, dimming, and then he heard her voice. Soft, slow, the same whisper the women swore they'd heard by the river, better still than shackled. He froze. The voice came from below, but from inside the hollow. "Judith?" he breathed. The silence answered. Then came a sound that was not silence, the sound of chains snapping one by one. By nightfall, Josiah had sealed the hole with bricks, poured salt into the cracks, muttering verses he half remembered. He ordered the cabin locked, forbidden, left to rot. But that night, every nail in the floorboards rose from the wood, bent backward, as though something beneath had pushed them out. The next morning, Josiah's men found him sitting on the cabin steps, eyes open, skin grey as ash, his hands blistered, his mouth full of dirt. Beneath his boots the ground was soft, freshly turned, as if something had burrowed upward and stopped at his feet. Dinah came again that evening. She knelt at the doorway, whispered a single prayer, and then she saw what the men had missed. Under the cracked threshold, half buried in the dust, lay a single length of chain, no longer iron, but bone polished smooth, hand marked with the same spiral Judith had drawn to seal the silence. When Dinah touched it, it burned cold. And in the distance, somewhere deep beneath the fields, she thought she heard the faint rattle of hundreds more, moving, waking, remembering. The wind carried their sound through the magnolia leaves, soft as the breath of the unborn. And from the well the water began to turn white. They said the night air was thick enough to breathe wrong, like the world itself had forgotten how to draw breath, like the fields were holding something back, waiting for it to be born. The first scream came from the east wing, where the master slept with a pistol beneath his pillow. And by the time the echo reached the slave quarters, 3 more voices joined in from distant rooms, each wrenched awake by the same dream of blood and soil, and something clawing from beneath the house. They said the dogs wouldn't bark that night, only whimpered and pressed their bodies flat to the ground, as if the earth itself commanded silence. And out in the fields, Judith stood barefoot among the corn, her face pale in the moonlight, her eyes half closed like someone listening to a lullaby from underground. When the men came stumbling from their rooms, masters and overseers both, they told of hands pushing through their dream sheets, of the weight of a woman's belly pressing down on their ribs, of muffled cries echoing from beneath their own skin. And when they woke, they swore they could still hear the panting, not theirs, but something older, slower, patient. They searched the fields that morning, thinking Judith must have cursed the wells or buried charms again. But she only smiled, whispering as she moved between them. "They ain't curses," she said softly, her voice low like rust in the throat. "They're returns." That day the sun refused to warm the soil, and every mare on the plantation miscarried before noon, their foals still and pale as wax figures, their eyes open, as though they'd seen what was coming before the men did by dusk. The overseer's wife collapsed mid-prayer, clutching her stomach, sobbing for a child that had been gone 2 years past, and when they pried her hands away, they found her palms bloodied with scratches shaped like infant fingers. The masters tried to burn Judith's cabin that night, but when they reached it, they found the floor wet with milk, dripping through the boards as though it flowed from within the earth itself. And beneath the table, wrapped in linen and silence, lay the remnants of dozens of tiny chains, broken, rusted, and still warm to the touch. Judith was gone. But the next morning, when the men gathered in the field, they saw her dress hung high on the scarecrow's frame, and from beneath the hem, faint cries echoed. Newborn, hungry, eternal. And still the wind moved like breath through the corn, whispering names the masters swore they'd never taught their slaves. The fields had remembered, the house had remembered, and every man who dreamed that night dreamed again of blood and birth and reckoning. If you wish to see what the earth keeps buried, and what the census forgot to name, subscribe to Forgotten Census before the next story wakes you in your sleep. No one remembered who first noticed it, only that by the time the sun rose over the cane fields, every woman refused to draw water alone. The well behind the sugar shed had always been deep, older than the house itself, older than the name carved into its stone lip. And when the new slaves were brought from the coast, the elders warned them, never lean too close when the wind sleeps. But after Judith vanished, the warnings turned to whispers, and the whispers turned to silence. When the women gathered that morning, their buckets trembling in the dawn chill, they leaned over the rim to see their faces, and found none staring back. The water was still, black as cooled iron, but empty, a void where eyes and mouths should have been, as if the well had swallowed every reflection it was ever asked to keep. They thought it was a trick of the light, but even at noon, when the sun struck the stones until they steamed, the water gave nothing back, only a faint glimmer of something moving far below, something slow, metallic, deliberate. That evening, Mary Ellen, who was the youngest, dropped a pebble in, just to hear the sound. There was no splash, only a muffled chime. Like iron striking bone that night, the old house creaked with thirst, and the overseer's daughter woke screaming, her hair dripping as if she'd been dragged from a river, her mouth whispering Judith's name over and over, until her voice went hoarse the next day. The well rope came up frayed and wet, though no one had drawn from it since dawn, and when the women touched the bucket's rim, their hands came away stained with rust or blood. They could not tell, no one spoke. But everyone knew. Something beneath had begun to rise one evening. When the cicadas died all at once, Ruth dared to look deeper than the rest, pressing her face near enough that her breath rippled the surface. And that's when the water moved. not upward but outward, as if reaching toward her. And in that dark shimmer, she saw not her own reflection but Judith's, smiling faintly, eyes open, hair floating as though underwater, her lips mouthing words the living could not hear. Ruth stumbled back screaming, but the others saw nothing, only the water stilling again. Sealing itself like glass later that night, she was gone. Her footprints led from her cabin to the well, but never away from it. They say if you lean close enough now when the moon sits just above the tree line, you can still hear her voice, not crying but humming softly, like a mother lulling something unseen to sleep beneath the surface. And if you look too long into that black mirror, your face begins to fade too, as though it no longer belongs to this side of the water. The well does not thirst anymore. It remembers, and somewhere below, Judith's shadow lingers, waiting for the next reflection foolish enough to meet her eyes. The first thing they noticed wasn't the cradle, but the smell it crept through the quarters at dusk, thick and clinging, the kind of sweetness that doesn't come from sugar, but from something gone soft in the heat, something that used to live. The smokehouse had always been a place of preservation, where salt, fire and patience kept rot at bay. But that week, the air itself began to spoil. Flies clung to the rafters, unmoving as if drunk on the scent, and the dogs that prowled the back fields would not come near the threshold inside. The air shimmered with warmth, the kind that breathes on your neck when no one stands behind you, and amid the racks of hanging carcasses, beef, pig, and deer, there was something else that should not have been there, a cradle, small and white once, now greyed with ash, its rockers steady though no wind passed through. The first to see it was Martha, sent to fetch salt pork for the master's supper, and when she came running back across the yard, her eyes looked wrong, like she'd seen something that hadn't finished showing itself. She said it moved, not the cradle itself, but the air around it rippling like heat over sand. The overseer laughed and sent 2 men to check, but when they opened the door, both stopped short at the threshold, hands clenching their shirts as if the smell itself had fingers. The smoke was heavy and alive, turning slow, spiraling like a serpent, and through it they could hear, faintly, a soft rhythmic sound, like a mother's foot tapping the floor to keep a lullaby's pace. No one would step closer by morning. The master ordered the cradle burned. They dragged it out into the yard, set it upon a pile of dried cane and struck a match. But when the flame touched the wood it hissed, not like sap or oil, but like something exhaling. The fire went out before it began. Someone, old Cora, who'd been midwife before Judith took the birthing room, whispered that the cradle was not meant to burn because it had not been made here. Not built by any living hand. Judith made it, she said, her voice brittle, for the ones who never cried. That night, the smokehouse door slammed itself shut. They found the latch warped, as if struck from the inside, and all through the night, the sound of the cradle creaked through the walls, a slow, steady rhythm, too heavy for an empty thing at dawn. When they forced the door open again, the cradle was gone. In its place lay a smear of soot shaped like 2 small handprints, pressed deep into the packed dirt, as though something had pushed itself up from the floor and crawled away into the dark. The hanging carcasses swayed, though there was no wind, and beneath the lowest rack a shape moved, small, deliberate, dragging something wrapped in linen. No one waited to see what it carried by the next evening. The smell had changed again, not sweet but clean, too clean, as though fire had passed unseen through the room and burned everything living in silence. Cora went missing the same night. The women said she'd gone to quiet the cradle, to rock it one last time, and that when she sang the air went still, and the sound of breathing stopped. But come morning, the smokehouse was empty again. Only the hook where the cradle had hung still turned in slow circles, clicking softly like a heartbeat caught in metal, and though the room was still, if you pressed your ear to the smoke-stained wall, you could still hear it, that faint creak, that whisper of wood over wood, rocking, always rocking, as if waiting for the next soul small enough to fit inside. The preacher arrived at dawn, his boots wet with dew, his breath turning to mist as he crossed the field where no birds sang. He came from 3 towns over, summoned by the master himself, for there were whispers now that Judith Harper's spirit had not gone to rest, that her name had begun to root in the soil, spreading like something that could not die by the time he reached the big house. Even the dogs had stopped barking, their tails tucked low, eyes fixed on the smokehouse that no one dared to enter anymore. The preacher was a hard man, one of those who believed sin could be boiled out of the flesh like fever. And when the master told him of Judith, of the milk gone sour and the empty well and the cradles that rocked without wind, he smiled thinly and said, "Evil is only as strong as the silence around it." That night, he called every soul to the clearing by the old sycamore, the one where Judith had once sung lullabies to the field children after work hours. Songs no one remembered the words to anymore, only the rhythm, slow and heavy. Like a heartbeat heard from beneath the ground, he opened his Bible and began to preach. But before the first verse could leave his mouth, the air shifted, the wind dropped, the fire guttered, and the leaves above them stilled like held breath. Someone whispered her name, not loud, not in defiance, but soft, a mother's voice soothing something restless in the dark. "Judith," they said, and the syllables seemed to echo, not forward but downward, into the earth itself. The preacher gripped his Bible tighter, his hands trembling as the leather began to grow warm, the edges curling as though the pages themselves were recoiling from what was being said. "Blasphemy," he hissed. "You invite her back with every breath." But even as he spoke, smoke began to rise from between his fingers, and the gold lettering on the cover, Holy Scripture, blackened until it was unreadable. He dropped it, but it did not fall. It hung for a heartbeat, suspended in the air, then burst open on its own, pages fluttering though there was no wind, and from the hollow where the binding met the spine, something began to drip thick, dark and slow. The women gasped, clutching one another, but none moved closer, and in that strange half-light, the preacher's voice faltered. He looked up then, past the fire, past the terrified faces, to the tree line beyond the clearing, and saw her Judith, or what was left of her. She stood half in shadow, half in moonlight, her skin pale as ash, her eyes still and knowing, her hands cradling something wrapped in white cloth. The preacher stepped forward, trembling, forcing his voice to rise above the trembling leaves. "Spirit," he said, "you will trouble this place no longer." But Judith only smiled, and the thing in her arms began to move. The bundle twitched once, twice then stilled, and though no sound came, the women fell to their knees, clutching their stomachs as if remembering something they had tried to forget. "You took their names from me," she whispered, her voice carrying like smoke, "but not their breath." The preacher staggered back, his boots sinking into the soil, and when he looked down, the ground was soft, pulsing, breathing, as though it had become the skin of something buried alive beneath them. He shouted Scripture until his throat tore, but the words no longer meant what they once did. They twisted in the air, turning strange, unfamiliar, as though being spoken backward. The fire went out, and in the silence that followed, they heard it, a sound low and rhythmic, the sound of tiny heartbeats rising from below. The preacher's lantern flickered once, and in that brief light, they saw the ground move. Dozens of small shapes pressing up from beneath the dirt, their outlines faint, their hands impossibly small. Every woman screamed at once when the light returned. The preacher was gone, his Bible smouldering on the ground, a print of his hand burned into the leather. Only one page remained untouched by the flame, a single verse from Exodus, "Let my people go." By morning, the fields were silent again. The sycamore's roots had cracked open, and beneath them, the soil steamed like breath in winter. The women who had whispered Judith's name would not speak again, but when the wind passed over the fields, their voices seemed to murmur through the cane, a lullaby that no one could quite understand, and deep in the hollow where the preacher once stood, the ground still moved softly, like a cradle being rocked from below. The fields began to hum before dawn. It wasn't a sound the living made, not quite, but something softer, lower, like the earth sighing through its teeth, a vibration that shivered through the cane, through the barns, through the walls of the quarters where no one could sleep. The women said Judith had gone into the soil, and the soil was remembering her at first. It was only a rumor that the cotton had changed, that the bowls no longer opened with a crisp snap, but with a sound wet and thick, like something being torn from flesh. The overseer laughed when he heard it, but by the second week of harvest, even he would not step into the rows alone, because every picker came away the same, their hands stained dark and shining, their fingers slick with something that was not sap, not dew, but real red. The first man to speak of it was Ezekiel, a quiet one, too old for field work, but still made to pick under the master's eye. He came to the porch that evening, trembling, his sack half full, his palms dripping. He said he'd seen faces among the cotton, pale and soft like the petals, mouths open as if whispering, eyes that blinked only when no one watched directly. The master struck him for blasphemy, but the next morning, the blood came again, buckets filled faster than they should have, the cotton heavy and wet, and when the women boiled it clean to spin, the water turned pink, then rusted brown, and the house filled with the scent of iron. Someone said Judith's cradle, the one found in the smokehouse, had been stuffed with this same cotton once. White as morning linen, soft enough to hush a breath before it became a cry by nightfall. The wind carried a faint whisper through the rows, no words, only the rhythm of breathing, slow and in sync with the rise and fall of the stalks. The overseer rode through at dusk, lantern in hand, muttering that the workers were weak, superstitious, poisoned by fear when the lantern light swept over the fields. The cotton seemed to glow, hundreds of white heads swaying gently as though something unseen moved beneath them. He dismounted to inspect one plant, tearing a bowl open with his knife. The cotton inside pulsed once before going still. He froze, staring at the blade in his hand, where a droplet, unmistakably blood, gathered at the tip and slid down the metal. The next morning his wife was found kneeling in her room, her nightgown soaked, her eyes open and unfocused, the bed behind her slick with what the doctor called a quiet tragedy. No child, no cry, only the sheet folded around a single cotton blossom, white and trembling, still dripping red at its edges after that night. No one went near the fields at moonrise, but the cotton grew faster, thicker, hungrier. Its roots crawled over the rows like veins, threading themselves deeper into the earth as if feeding on something buried below, something that should have never been disturbed. Old Cora said the ground was giving back what Judith had taken, the blood, the breath, the silence. When the rains came, the fields flooded red. The master tried to burn them, barrels of pitch, torches in the dark. But every time he struck a match, the flame died before it reached the soil. It was said the air was too heavy, too wet with spirit. And on the third night the cotton began to bloom out of season, unfurling in the moonlight like skin peeled back to show what grows beneath. Those who stood at the windows swore they could see movement between the rows, shapes low and crawling, cradling something in their arms, something that rocked and hummed softly, too soft to be heard but enough to be felt by dawn. The fields were still again, the master was gone. Only his horse returned, reins dragging, its hooves stained red up to the knees. They found him days later in the lower field, half buried among the roots, his mouth stuffed full of cotton, his eyes open and filled with the same white fiber that grew from his chest, and when they cut him down, the cotton bled anew that night. The pickers burned their clothes, washed their hands in lye and prayed, not to God, but to Judith, for her to take back whatever she had given. But the field stayed alive, whispering in the wind, swaying like something that remembers breath, and when the moonlight struck the bowls just right, they glistened red, soft, wet, newborn breathing, still waiting for the next harvest to come. They said Judith's cabin had been locked from the outside the night she vanished, sealed with 7 nails and a psalm scratched into the frame. Deliver us from the works of the restless. Yet every morning, the door stood open again, not wide, not inviting, just enough to show the edge of darkness inside, the glint of something wet against the floorboards. The air that came from within was wrong, thick and sour, carrying the faint smell of milk, turned to rotten iron left too long in the rain. The overseer ordered the door nailed shut again, each blow of the hammer echoing through the empty yard like a heartbeat. No one wanted to hear, and when the final nail was driven in, the silence that followed felt almost holy, almost that night. The first cry came, faint at first, distant, muffled, like a child learning to breathe in secret, then louder, wetter, too full of life to be imagined. No one dared to move. The women clutched their children tight, whispering prayers under their breath, and the men turned their faces to the wall, pretending sleep, but the sound went on, winding through the quarters, soft as a lullaby, until it reached the very edge of the master's porch by dawn. The door stood open again. The nails lay scattered in the dust, their tips blackened as though burned. The psalm carved into the frame now warped. The letters stretched and twisted into shapes no man could read inside. The room was untouched, except for the cradle. It had not been there before, small, made of rough wood, its rockers carved with spirals that led nowhere. It sat at the center of the cabin, rocking slowly in the stale air empty, except it wasn't. The master swore the air around it shimmered, as if something invisible hung there, something breathing. Slow and deliberate, he shouted for it to be burned, but when the men struck their torches, the flames dimmed. The smoke curling backward as though refusing to enter, Cora, the midwife, stepped forward then, her voice trembling. "She don't want it burned," she said. "She want it finished." The men didn't ask what that meant. But that night, when the crying began again, it came not from the cabin, but from the very walls of the big house. The sound moved from room to room, soft as a sigh, and every candle flickered low when it passed. The master's wife woke screaming before dawn, her nightdress damp with milk. Though her own child had died years before, she said she'd dreamt of Judith standing at the foot of her bed, her skin grey and gleaming like wax, her eyes two bottomless hollows filled with something that shifted. Not tears, not blood, something older. She was holding it, the wife whispered, but it wasn't. It wasn't alive. By morning the cabin door was closed again this time. No one touched it. The master ordered the field hands to stay clear, and for 2 nights the plantation fell into a strange, uneasy quiet. Then came the 3rd night. A storm rolled in from the west, black and swollen, lightning crawling over the horizon like veins under skin, and the wind began to sing through the cane. It was not a storm song. It was a woman's voice, long and low, humming the same tune the women once sang to their newborns before Judith silenced them all. When the thunder broke, the cabin door burst open on its own. Every light went out, and those who looked, even for a second, swore they saw something moving inside, crawling along the floorboards, dragging itself toward the threshold. Something small, wrapped in linen, glistening as it moved. The next morning, the storm had passed. The fields lay drenched in fog, and the door was gone entirely. Not broken, not torn away, simply gone, leaving behind only the frame, standing alone like a gate with nothing beyond it. The inside of the cabin was blackened now, every surface scorched, every wall burned to ash, except for one mark on the floor, a single outline small as an infant's. Pressed deep into the wood as though by unimaginable heat, the house remained empty after that, untouched. But some nights, when the moon hung low and the fields whispered, a faint knocking could still be heard where the door once stood, not from the outside, from within, and each time it comes, the sound is softer, slower, as if whatever knocks is learning patience, waiting for someone foolish enough to answer. By spring, no children were born within 20 miles of the Harper land. The midwives who touched the soil went barren, and beneath the magnolia tree, they say Judith still kneels, one hand pressed to the earth, listening, keeping the unborn free. The first stillness came in April, when the air grew so heavy that even the cicadas fell quiet, their songs caught in their throats, and the women of the valley began to dream of cradles swinging in empty rooms, unseen hands rocking them in rhythm with their own heartbeats. It was said that Judith had cursed the land before they burned her cabin, whispering into the soil a vow that no womb would know peace until justice was given, that no birth cry would rise until her name was remembered in mercy rather than fear. The midwives tried to pray, but their rosaries turned hot in their palms, and their lips blistered when they said deliverance. One, a gray-haired woman named Alma, tried to flee north, but the night before she left, she found her wagon wheels tangled with cotton roots that had pushed through the earth overnight, white tendrils wet as veins. She burned them, but the smell that rose was not plant, it was flesh. By May, the town of Hollow Bend had forgotten laughter. The young wives, once bright and full of spring, moved like shadows through the streets, hands pressed against their bellies, as though holding something in or begging something to return. Men whispered that perhaps it was the fever again, but no doctor dared to come near. Those who did found their instruments rusted, their mirrors cracked, and their horses refusing to cross the Harper fields. It was Mary Holt who first saw her, or said she did. The girl had gone to draw water before dawn when she saw, beneath the magnolia tree, a woman kneeling, her hair long and pale with ash, her dress soaked through as though she'd risen from the earth itself. Mary swore Judith was listening, not to the wind, not to God, but to the ground, her ear pressed to it, her fingers buried in the roots, as if feeling for heartbeats below. And when Mary stepped closer, she said the woman looked up, smiled faintly and whispered, "Hush now. They're almost here." After that, no one drew water from that well again. The preacher came in June, a man named Gable with a voice that could shake rafters, or so they said. He stood before the magnolia with his Bible raised high, the crowd trembling behind him, and he cried out that the Lord's mercy would not suffer a witch's ghost. But the words turned to ash in his mouth, literally. Black flakes spilled from his lips, fluttering like burnt pages, and the Bible in his hand began to smoulder until he dropped it screaming, the pages curling inward like a dying flower. And from the smoke came the scent of milk and iron, the smell of birth and blood and things undone. That night the magnolia tree began to bloom again, but its blossoms were wrong. Each one held the faintest crimson vein beneath its petals, like tiny hearts trapped inside white flesh. The people who dared look closer swore they saw faces in them, small, peaceful, sleeping faces. By midsummer the land had gone silent entirely. The birds no longer came, the frogs no longer sang. Even the river seemed to flow quieter, as though it too was listening. The women who had once prayed for children now prayed for sound, for anything that would break the suffocating stillness pressing down upon their homes. One night under the swollen moon, Alma the midwife, the same who had tried to flee, gathered what was left of her courage and walked barefoot to the Harper land. The air was heavy as a held breath, and the magnolia tree shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Beneath it Judith still knelt. Her eyes were closed, her lips moving in silent prayer, her palm resting flat upon the soil. "Judith," Alma whispered, voice trembling, "what is it you're keeping?" Judith's eyes opened then, dark, deep and endless, and for the first time Alma understood the terrible tenderness in her curse. "They're still inside," Judith said softly, voice like the rustle of mourning veils. "The mothers, the children, the cries, they're all still inside the earth. I keep them safe from what waits above." And before Alma could speak again, the ground beneath her feet shifted, pulsing once like a living thing. 1,000 faint cries rose, not from the air but from below. Tiny, muffled, unborn voices weeping in unison. The midwife fell to her knees, clawing at the soil, screaming for mercy, for release, but the earth only tightened. The roots coiling around her wrists like fingers shushing her back into silence. When dawn came, the magnolia stood still, its branches heavy with blossoms redder than before, and beneath it, half-buried, Alma's shawl fluttered gently in the morning wind, soaked through with milk and blood. They say the silence that followed was not absence, but waiting, that somewhere deep beneath that cursed soil, Judith still listens, and the unborn still whisper to her, soft as breath against bone, "Not yet, not yet." And in the distance, at the edge of the field, a single cradle began to rock, though there was no wind, no child, and no one left alive to sing it still.